So welcome to the next section of our Invasive Plant Academy, in which we will discuss how to survey a property to prepare an invasive plant control practice plan. Joining me this morning and driving the PowerPoint is Joseph Dembeck, Joe Dembeck, Executive Director of the Somerset, blah, blah, blah. That's going to happen today. Executive Director of the Somerset County Soil and Water Conservation District. Joe, will you introduce yourself, please?
Yes, good morning, everybody. So for the last couple of years, our district's been working with the Maine Natural Areas Program to perform invasive plant surveys throughout Somerset County. I think we probably have about 20 some under our belt now. So we've learned a lot in 2 years, and we're hoping to provide some information to you folks on how to better prepare yourselves and to avoid some of the pitfalls we found early on. And I'll let you start it off, Nancy.
Great. So I don't have anything else to say at this slide. Go ahead, Joe. Sorry, Joe. So I wrote down that you were doing this slide. Have I got things staggered?
Yeah, but that's okay.
Okay, that's okay. So I'll just note that everything is off by one and start. So Joe and I have prepared sort of a talk with an outline of two phases. So the first phase is in the office, pre-survey data and information review. And then the second phase is the actual field survey where you're on site doing your survey and collecting data.
Probably one of the most useful forms I found in doing these surveys is creating a landowner questionnaire. Nancy's going to place this on the project website if it's not there already, so you don't have to worry about reading the small print here. But I definitely suggest everybody take a look at it and tweak it to your needs that you use with your clients if you're a forester or another other natural resource professional. This really gets us prepared in what to worry about for unique habitats, concern areas on the property, recent practices on the property, and practices potentially planned for the near future. And for this presentation today, throughout, we're going to be using this example property here, because as you'll see, as we discuss further on, it has a lot of the features that we look for in our planning as well as in our field survey components. Anything you'd like to add there, Nancy?
Nope, I just shared a link to a Word document of the questionnaire in the chat.
Great. Okay, off to you, Nancy.
Great. Thanks, Joe. And I think we're back on track now, Joe. So yeah, the first thing or one of the first things to do is to check iMapInvasives to see if there are already records in the area. So if you are surveying a property next door to the Dodge Point Preserve in Newcastle, you'll be interested to know what plants are already recorded next door. So this is just a good practice and a first step. If you're at the state scale, the data are aggregated, so just be aware that that's what those hexagons represent in this screen. When you zoom in further, you're going to see the confirmed records in your area.
And one note here to make is just because you see lots of points or no points doesn't mean there's nothing there. Often it's just no surveys have taken place.
That's a very important point.
And this is a good example here because Somerset County is just to the south and east of this photo, but Penobscot County to the north hasn't had any program surveys, performed as part of this joint program. So it looks like there's nothing there, but for folks that are familiar with this area, no, there's a lot out there.
Yeah, just to remember that lack of data does not mean that invasive plants are not present.
And for our example property, which is at the point of the arrow, you can see that there's some data in the surrounding area, and it varies from, a single point here for a bridge crossing that was looked at to a regional park, to a landowner that had property surveyed as part of a program. But if we zoomed in too far, we would find no data points around. But this gives you an idea. If you clicked onto these, if you're an IMAP program and not a still picture like this, just what species people in the area were finding. It's just helpful in preparing. This is what we're looking at now, is really preparing.
Another website to check in terms of preparing for your survey is the Beginning with Habitat online map viewer. The Beginning with Habitat program is a program that shows important natural resources in the landscape, and they have a nice ArcGIS online map viewer. These are some, this is a screenshot of the map viewer page that you would access via the link in the slide. And that's just a good reminder for me to say we will be sharing PDFs of our PowerPoint presentations so that you'll have access to all the links that are included in these presentations. But if you do a web search for Maine Beginning with Habitat, you'll find this website where you can choose from a map that shows riparian habitats, map 2, which shows special plant and animal habitats, and map 3, which shows conserved land and undeveloped habitat. And if you have further questions about data that appears in these locations, feel free to reach out to my colleague Lisa here at the Maine Natural Areas Program by emailing maine.nap@maine.gov. And Lisa can help you understand more about specific records that might be located on a property. But reviewing this in advance to know whether there are some inland wading bird and waterfowl habitat mapped on the property, or whether there is a rare plant known from the property, or whether there is a large undeveloped forested block that the property sits in the middle of, can just help you give context and also potentially prioritize invasive plant management within that area, prioritize search and invasive plant management within the property.
So for our example property, which is right in this area, by looking at the plant and animal habitats viewer, we found 2 hits here. We've got a stream system that's denoted as having a state threatened species, in this case, eastern brook floater, a freshwater mussel, as well as having a component of the property here as part of a mapped deer wintering area. So again, just, if you were actively on the viewer screen and not a still shot like this, you could click on the components and that data would be brought up and such. And another component of this property, which is here, is the fact that it is part of a 4,500 acre contiguous parcel of land. So just getting yourself familiarized with where the property sits geographically, what issues may be out there to deal with or be concerned about, and to look into further. This is the part I really like, is reviewing aerial photographs, topos, digital imagery. I use Google Earth a lot. I have access, as do most people, to aerial photos. If you go to a Soil and Water District office, most of us have everything from 1930 series flights up till about the 1990s. And they can really help you look at, what was in pasture, what was in cropland, and over time, how regeneration occurred, or if plantings occurred during the 1940s or 50s with, evergreen species. Uh, it's really helpful. And in this example, I'm going to talk specifically about Google Earth and just some of the imagery that you have available and how you can use it. But first, we'll go right to just the old topo maps. We have our property right here. Basically shows it's pretty flat. The non-green areas, demonstrate agricultural fields, open land, waste areas. To me, this isn't as informative as I like to see. But if I go to Google Earth, on the upper pane of the Google Earth when you're running it, you have an icon here that you click on, and it'll give you all the series in a line of photos that are available. And then you can work your way and click through it to see, which year's photographs were taken. So here we have our example property, and this is what it looks like in 1997, where it sits on a landscape with adjoining land use is occurring around the properties. Fast forward to 2003, so we just jumped ahead 7 years. Not really much has changed on the landscape visually at this scale. We go to 2007 and we start seeing some changes that will help us think about how we're going to survey this property or find areas that we want to assess. So on the example property here, there was a roughly 5-acre patch cut removal that occurred in January of 2017. On adjacent farmland to the south, we see expansion of the farm fields. Fast forward again to 2011, next series of photos, we see again more expansion of farm fields. So a lot more edge habitat being created, more disturbed soils. On our example property, no change is noted from this visualization. 2018 for this area of the state is the most current imagery. And when we look at it, we see a few more things occurring. We see a widening of the power line corridor here. And then we see an adjacent property that had a very heavy harvest. So again, we've got areas that are changing in their cover types, disturbed soils, and that may give us a reason to be concerned about, say, the northern boundary of the property here with our surveying. Whereas if we looked back to 1997 and this was fully forested, we wouldn't have had that open area and disturbed area adjacent to it. Anything you'd like to add to that, Nancy?
The only thing, Joe, that I was thinking about when you originally had the topographic map up is that sometimes you can see, if you compare an older topographic map to a current aerial imagery map, areas which were previously open in the topographic map, as indicated by the white areas, that may be growing in, succeeding to forest. Excuse me. And so comparing those can help identify those areas of early successional habitat, which unfortunately often can have invasive plants. So that's a way that I sometimes use the topographic map.
On to you, Nancy.
Yeah, so based on your prep work, we suggest creating priority lists of highly probable areas, areas that are highly likely to have invasive plants, as well as some high quality areas to survey. And so, Joe, on the next slide, yeah, we have some highly probable areas. So these are areas that are more likely to have invasive plants because of human influence and land use history. So this would include utility right-of-ways, field edges, hedgerows, old logging landings, road and trail system, old homestead locations, current homestead location, evergreen stands and plantations. So just to note that the eligible acres are not intended to cover the residential landscaping area, but it's always good to check to make sure the landowner doesn't have anything really untoward planted right up there in the gardens. We've encountered, some hardy kiwi and akibia vines in planted areas where the landowner didn't know that those had the potential to be invasive, and so we were able to have a good conversation with the landowner, even though those are not strictly sort of forested areas or rural areas like a old field, but good to take a peek. The
And
high, oh, go ahead.
I was
Yep.
gonna say, I'll add to that too, Nancy, is remember a lot of these species we're talking about, state, federal, and county agencies, we actively sold them and handed them out in the 50s, 60s, 70s. So that current homestead location, if it's a farmstead location, we see it a lot in our county where, oh, that was the family that used to always buy from our district shrub and tree sales back in the 70s, and you'll find autumn olive, shrubby honeysuckle, bittersweet. They're almost like demonstration plantings for what we were saying was best practices at the time. And a lot of times those are the oldest examples of those species on a property. So it might be your biggest seed source.
Good point, Joe. And then there might be some high quality areas on the property that you want to be sure to check out because they're important natural resources, because they are riparian zones, beginning with habitat features or forest interior. So your priority targets for survey areas might include a mixture of these both highly likely areas as well as some forays into what might be considered high quality areas. So number 6 here, determining the property boundary and creating field maps. This is another way that we prepare. So you can look at tax maps that can be found on town websites often, or in the MEGIS, Maine Office of GIS layers. Um, and the property owner themselves may have information such as an existing survey or a forest management plan, or they may just be aware of marked boundary lines that are useful for determining the property boundary and creating your field maps to help you survey the property. Next slide. When you are actually on site at the property, we suggest driving or walking any road frontage on the property. Road frontage can be a highly probable area. Different methods can be used. For example, high priority areas, targeted search versus a grid search. And that could depend on the level of infestation when you arrive at the site. So if you, for example, are finding that the parcel is long and skinny with road frontage, but then, most of it is kind of a back lot, you may find that you want to take a more detailed survey effort in the areas that are closer to the homestead and the road, whereas in the back portions of the property, a more meandering search or just a search of the active forest roads might be all that's necessary. Minimum mapping, a realistic minimum mapping unit can be something that's helpful to get your head around. So, in other words, how far do I need to walk between invasive plants before I decide to, consider this small cluster of plants distinct from the one that I just walked past? And that's something that everybody will figure out in your own head. There's no rule in IMAP or for this program about that. But remember that the goal of this program eventually is to get the invasive plants treated. And so if you were the one who is going to be performing treatment, think about whether it would be helpful to have individual points for plants, that are 10 meters apart, or whether, in fact, the whole edge needs to be mapped as a polygon. That brings me to point number 4 about points versus polygons versus buffered lines. When thinking about how to draw those on the map, you might consider things like differences in percent cover or plant age or species mix. So it may be that the area closer to the road on the property has a higher percent cover of the barberry, and so you draw a separate polygon for that area as compared to the area that's transitioning between early successional forest and more mature forest. So that's a way to distinguish polygons based on percent cover. Another way is simply by realistic management areas. So sometimes the property is naturally broken into several areas, whether that's by roads or by a stream or river. And so sometimes I map different polygons based on the natural geography of the parcel. Because it's useful for management and just understanding, okay, so the shape, the polygon that I've mapped that's between the house and the landing, that's a discrete area that the landowner and the treatment professional can understand and work in. And so I wrap that separately than the denser stand that's on the other side of the house by the road. Those are just some examples of different ways to choose points versus polygons versus lines. So I didn't show an example of this in IMAP, but in IMAP you can draw a line, for example, on a field edge, and then buffer it, similar to how I buffered the point that I drew. And that effectively creates a polygon. So that's another way to take, you could take data in the field that would later turn into a buffered line. And then number 5, don't forget to keep a track of your survey route since it's required for mapping and verification of the survey.
So for this is just kind of an example for Nancy and I to talk a little bit about, what this looks like when we take points in the field. We'll talk in a little more detail tomorrow in the mapping component of the boot camp, about how to use, field sheets with maps that are marked up versus your electronic data you collect. But for this example here this is GPS points we took on a property we surveyed last year and just plotted out in Google Earth, and it gives us an understanding of what we're seeing. So it looks like a lot of points. Certain areas of this property that isn't shown up here, but we have maps of, this is a spruce stand, a planted spruce stand that I'm outlining. That's completely covered with Asiatic bittersweet, young growth underneath, shrubby honeysuckle, some barberry. On our maps, we would mark up something like that because we weren't going to take points because it was an easily defined area to highlight on our maps, make notes on our paper data sheets, and then when we enter it in the IMAP, it would, we didn't have to go along through it. But what you will see in the next slide is using buffered lines, which I like to use a lot because you find instances here where along sections of this field edge, there's a lot of shrubby honeysuckle. And in this property in particular, we believe was planted back in the 50s and 60s for erosion control right in here along a seasonal drainage swale with extensive shrubby honeysuckle. You're talking stuff that, is 3, 4, 5 inch in DBH or, a foot off the ground. And it's all, you can't work on it without chainsaws. But when you see the map, that's something we'd put a line on. It's easy to identify, but then we'd buffer it based upon the, what we felt the width of it was. But the honeysuckle in this block here was different. It was younger. It was more spread out with great lower abundance, not much yet into an age class that was fruiting. So we would treat that differently than the buffer. When we go to the next slide to show
Hey,
what
Joe,
this looks.
actually, could you go back to that slide? There's
Yep.
a question in the chat that would be useful to answer here. So someone, Andy Schultz asked, why are evergreen stands and plantations highly probable areas? And so do you want to just speak on that for a sec?
So this is Joe Dembeck's opinion on this one. And I can base this on having extensive white pine stands on my own property that were natural. But it seems like roosting birds really utilize that cover during the summer growing season, especially think of fledgling robins. So they're feeding in the surrounding areas, but this is a great cover, in my opinion, and what I've seen of birds coming in the evening to roost. So you just fed on nice big clump of bittersweet berries here. You have berries along in here from shrubby honeysuckle. You go in to this interior, you roost for the night. Because they move through your system quickly, they're depositing it there, the seeds with a nice little nutrient packet. And we see a lot of growth. And these are the species, as Nancy mentioned earlier today, that are generalists. So they're very tolerant of variable soil conditions as well as shade and sun conditions. So we see a lot of, in my experience, a lot of shrubby honeysuckle, bittersweet more in openings, but also barberry in these areas. All three move by bird seeds. That's just from my experience and talking with other folks that have, done these surveys.
Yeah, and I think that's right on, Joe, and my experience too. Jessica Leahy also points out that these areas also often have a history of being in agricultural use, and so sort of by association with humans and the various plantings that we use, unfortunately, during that first initial establishment stage, the invasive plants can also thrive. So I think those are some of the reasons.
Right.
Thanks, Joe.
Yep. So taking those data points that were all over the place, this is kind of what we ended up with for all species infestations on this property, was some of those data points down in here was actually outlining a polygon in our field notes. Other ones over here were either small clumps or single plants. That was all part of our field notes. Start and finish along a field row here, a field edge for species. This is the only species, this is kind of interesting, is the only area I've seen European barberry so far in Somerset County. And that was uniquely found in here. But taking those points and just utilizing them to create our different layers. I like, as Nancy and I talk and putting these presentations together, I like using buffered circles for small areas because I can take a point in the middle and then with the field notes mention 20-foot radius, 50-foot radius, I can then just buffer it. So I don't have to worry about trying to keep my hand steady and make a polygon in IMAP. I can make a point and buffer it. Any thoughts from you, Nancy, on this?
Yeah, so it just there are going to be multiple different workflows, I guess I'll call them, that we go through in the IMAP bootcamp. Suggested ways to kind of take data in the field and then migrate and enter the data into IMAP. This is so Joe's just explaining one approach that he takes when he's in the field. So collecting waypoints on a handheld GPS was what he did to create the last slide, and then he uses that information to draw in iMapInvasives. So that was kind of prep and also a little bit about methods. When you get to surveying the property on site, you want to obviously check your identified highly probable and high quality areas. You have to be mindful that your minimum survey time is met based on the acreage and infestation level as indicated in the program manual, and we'll come back to this. We have another slide on that. And another thought regarding your on-site work is flag example species of invasive plants found and/or isolated occurrences or edges of occurrences to assist in relocating them for treatment. You would want to ask the landowner prior to survey if they would like this. I mean, some landowners, despise flagging. Others would be happy to have this done in anticipation of treatment. So obviously, taking precise coordinates where you have an isolated plant in the woods is useful for relocating it. But if you also flag it, that makes it that much easier for someone coming to treat to re-find that plant in the future. So that's something that you might consider doing if the landowner agrees.
And taking a look at our example property here, we go down the list of highly probable areas. We have, utility right away going through the property. We have field edges on the property. We have hedgerows on the property. Old log landings. Knowing this property, there was a log landing recently used here, and there was an old log landing used in this area here. Road and trail system, we'll show that in a second. Old homestead locations. If you look back and the property owner has information, like back in 1930, this was almost all pasture cropland with a small woodlot in this area and a small woodlot up in this area. But the homestead location's always been in one spot. There's no other foundations or other structures or old inhabitants on the property. Evergreen stands, either planted or natural. With regeneration of this farmland, there's significant pine stand here, pine stands all in this area here, as well as here. So we're getting the information that we either asked on the questionnaire or we used from this highly probable areas list to start looking at in the field. Also, the high quality areas, we have 2 riparian zones, one along the river, one along the stream frontage in the rear of the property. We showed earlier the beginning with habitat features. So we have a state threatened species inhabiting the stream. We have the deer wintering area that includes this part of this property, as well as this property overall as part of a 4,500 acre contiguous block without any road systems internally. And talking about forest interiors. Oops. So easily visible from our pre-survey work was this patch cut. So that's an area that would be, in my mind, I would definitely want to look at because that may have regrowth and may be invasives there. What we found out from the landowner questionnaire is there's another patch cut that was put in this section of the property after the last aerial image was completed. So that's where getting property information that's current is helpful. And that would be an area that obviously we'd want to go and survey in detail as part of our highly probable areas. Future plans for the property, landowners looking to thin 14-acre stand of white pine there, so a future disturbance in the near future, as well as a smaller thinning on another pine stand on the property within the next 5 years. So areas that if we know that they're going to occur some kind of practices there that may provide conditions ideal for the spread or initial infestation of invasives, we can explain to the landowner while surveying if we found honeysuckle, bittersweet, something in these stands that pre-treatment's recommended prior to the disturbance. Big ones we see on the landscape are, utility right-of-ways. And you should ask the question to the landowner is, this right-of-way that goes through your property, is it maintained by the power company and its contractors? Or do you have a vegetation management agreement with the power company where the landowner, have the responsibility to control the vegetation growth to the standards of the power company? And this is just a quick example of, what a road system image would look like. So if you're searching the property, areas that you can access and walk on by vehicle. Say you couldn't drive to the field, you have a lot more time on your feet versus if the landowner says, nope, you can park out in the middle of the field, you can more quickly get to areas to survey. And going back, you know, this is a property in my estimation requires a fair amount of time to survey because we have so many features to look at. The road frontage, the riparian zones, the field edges, recent forest harvest activities, planned forest harvest activities, and we have an adjoining property that had a significant harvest change in vegetation type that we'd want to look in this area here in some detail. I think that's about all I wanted to say with this. Nancy?
Yeah, it's great, Joe. Thanks for stepping through this example. So we wanted to highlight the minimum survey time guidelines, which are found in the program manual. So for reference, this is on page 16 of the program manual, and it does go into a bit more detail there. But just to kind of walk you all through, how we created these numbers. So let me just say, it takes more time to survey a highly infested property. So on this table on the left, you see the level of infestation, low, medium, high. Obviously, those are very qualitative descriptors, but it is a fact that more highly infested properties take longer to survey. Properties that are complex and that have, multiple highly probable areas, that can give you a clue that, hey, this is going to be a property that falls, maybe even if it's lightly infested, into a higher range, within areas that have sort of a range. So, based on the efforts of the Maine Natural Areas Program and our partners at the Soil and Water Conservation Districts over the past 6 years or so, we sort of made this table of our thoughts, estimates of approximately how long it should take to survey properties of different sizes based on their level of infestation. And so we hope that this will be a guideline for you as you're thinking about how to price your plans for clients. And this is also going to be our guidelines for minimum survey effort required. So we are requiring a certain amount of time spent on the ground, the dirt time, where you're out there and you are surveying. And so this is what we're going to use. We welcome your feedback. So as Andy Schultz said, we're building this thing while we're driving it, and we hope that these are accurate estimates. However, we are open to feedback about this. I also want to say that if this is your first time ever doing this, the first couple properties that you do are going to take longer because they're the first couple times. Just like the first time you hold an Invasive Plant Academy, it takes a lot longer than the second time you hold an Invasive Plant Academy. And you can think of other analogies from your own life. You're trying to learn how to do something new. The first time you do it, it's going to take longer. The first time my husband made me a cutting board, it took forever and the outcome was not that great. The second time he tried to make me a cutting board, it didn't take as long, and I'm still using it today. So that's just to say that allow yourself a bit more time on those first couple properties that you do, and realize that if you're only planning to do a couple properties a year, you may need to allow yourself a little bit more time overall. So I think that's what I wanted to say there. Anything to add, Joe? No. Okay, great. So marking invasive plants, we already sort of talked about this. If it's a real isolated plant that's too large for you to pull on the day of survey, you might want to mark that. If it's kind of the beginning and the end of something, you might want to mark that. If the landowner wants to learn to identify the plants, you might mark, a couple of each species that are in accessible area, close areas that are accessible that the landowner could learn. They make this pink tape that says invasive plant on it that I like, but you could use whatever tape. There's also an orange one that says invasive species if you prefer orange. So that's just an idea. Again, good to ask the landowner, and this would be, for landowner learning, but also it could be for treatment of these individuals and clumps. So that's kind of the end of our formal presentation, and we've got our contact information there. And there have been a couple questions in the chat. Since I'm not presenting now, I can actually see the chat. Joe is the one sharing screen at this point. So we had a question from Jake about surveying with drones. If you can use a drone faster than you can walk the field edge and you can accurately identify invasive plants with your drone, go for it. You'd need landowner permission, and obviously you'd need your small unmanned aerial system license and all that stuff. But I think that it's a possibility. And
Uh,
then looks like, go ahead,
can I
Joe.
add to that, Nancy?
Yeah.
I think the big thing for us all to remember with these surveys is the big infestations are really going to stand out. And if you see a field edge, a small opening in the woods, a pine stand that has a significant infestation, that to me is also a clue of, hey, there could be more than just that species there. So I can think of many times, even on my own property, where I just mainly have shrubby honeysuckle, but I go in those thick, dense areas, spend a little time looking around, and oh, look at that. Look at it. It's a juvenile burning bush. And you're trying to scratch your head figuring where'd it come from, because it's not within a half mile of the property. But because there's some activity or disturbance that's allowing the invasives to occur, you'll often will find these new species showing up. And those are the ones you really want to find quickly and take care of.
Yeah, great point, Joe. Um, Earlier in the presentation, when I talked about finding unusual things near the homestead, Jessica asked about any tips for how to handle a conversation with a landowner who has something planted that we don't advise, for example, currants or ribes. So yeah, I've had to have that conversation with a landowner where, I arrived and they had requested a survey, and I was surprised to find a variety of invasive plants growing near their home. And we just had sort of a candid conversation. I always try to present my thoughts as recommendations. And in the case of something, where I felt strongly, I would simply say, my professional opinion is that it would benefit your property to remove that plant. And obviously, sometimes that takes a while to digest, or they might have further questions to follow up with you. But yeah, it went well in the instance that I'm thinking of. I have had conversations with folks in the permaculture movement, and they have varying thoughts about things, and sometimes they disagree in the end. But they might say, well, I disagree, but I'm gonna say to the landowner, well, okay, I'll plant your kiwi, but remember that when you move off this property, someone has to tend that kiwi. You shouldn't just, let it go to the next landowner without explaining that, hey, this is a very aggressive plant, and you should keep it under control, or you should dig it out and get rid of it before you leave the property. I think that that is the extent of the questions that are related to how to serve. Oh, we've got something new. So, uh, Joe, we've got a question here from David. For the landowner plot you presented, how did you obtain updated year-over-year aerial photos?
So with that, you can go to Google Earth, which is a free download shareware. And I'm going to go quickly back as fast as I can to that part of the presentation. And when use Google Earth and you zoom into an area you're looking at, say this property here, on the toolbar that runs atop the screen in Google Earth, there's this little image with a clock face with a backwards arrow going back in time. By clicking on that, it'll highlight this bar, and it usually starts with when the earliest photo imagery was available, and it'll end with the most current photo. So just by clicking on it in different spots, you'll see these bars going down vertically will give you a new photo year. A lot of the photos in 1980s that were on here are a different scale and don't show up well. They're very blurry. So what I would do is I would click on it. The first one that showed up was 1997. And then as I show in these examples, the next one was 2003, 2007, 2011, 2018. I like going through these because I like to find a year when they're taking in the winter or before deciduous trees leaf out. So I get a better understanding of open areas on the property, maybe trail systems and stuff. Um, and the other way to look at older aerial imagery is to go to a soil and water district office or USDA office that has the old aerial flight maps. Um, some of us have them, some of us don't, but we know where they are for the county. And you can look at that manually to find the real old information. For those of you on the call that are foresters, especially private consulting foresters, those are resources that are used a lot in developing your forest management plans. So a lot of people are familiar with that.
Great. And Julie Davenport points out that the past imagery function on Google Earth is only available on the downloadable version of Google Earth, not in the browser version of Google Earth. So you do actually have to download the software, which I think, and Joe said that there is a free there's a free version of that.
Yeah, and that's a great point, Julie, for bringing up. And I think it's Google Earth. Yeah, either version, the Google Earth generic or the Google Earth Pro, they both have that feature there.
Great. So it's 10:49 and
Excuse
oh,
me, I just want to mention there was a question up there about using shape files with IMAP.
yeah, so I was gonna pause on that since it's not directly related to this. Well, it might be related to this presentation, but I can answer that question. So there's no bulk upload into IMAP. So users cannot upload files into IMAP. And that's because IMAP is a very complicated database. And so you can imagine for databases, you got to match all these fields and they have to be precisely matched. And so users can't just be uploading shapefiles. So the short answer is no. There is no upload of shapefiles into IMAP.